9 tips for a highly productive kitchen garden. These tips are a little bit different than usual, but if you do use them, they make a huge difference in terms of boosting the productivity and also the enjoyment of your garden. Now, the first tip is the most simple tip. It's the most obvious tip, but sometimes you just need to hear it again, and sometimes I need to tell this to myself. And it's the idea of just grow what you love. End of. Like, grow what you love eating. That's a really good start. So if you're not like the biggest fan of radish, that's totally okay. I know I always use this as an example, but if you're not a big fan of radish and you've got a small garden, then instead of taking up space for a crop that you're only semi-excited about, use that space for a crop that you are excited about, like peas or tomatoes or something like that. And you can also lean into this further by growing the things that maybe intrigue you the most or are maybe a bit of a challenge. For example, when we grew apricots or sweet potatoes, those were a surprise. If you care about something, you're more likely to look after it and give it the attention that it needs. And it's also so much more satisfying if every part of your garden is truly special to you. Next up is to identify all of the local resources that you can use to supercharge your garden. And this is going beyond the obvious, like using your neighbour's veg scraps for composting. Of course, there are lots of different materials you can use, like I use leaves from down the lane, or seaweed, or the manure for the hotbed is something that I can access whenever I want, as long as I bring a little share of the harvest as a thank you. But there's so many other types of resources that exist in our communities. One of the best is the resource of local gardening groups. They do things like seed swaps and plant swaps, which are a wonderful opportunity to get things where you don't always have to exchange money. And also, if you're a new gardener, the resource of local knowledge is priceless. Going down your local allotment, seeing what kind of varieties grow well, getting ideas from the veterans on the climate and the soil goes a huge way. My next tip is to utilize the idea of zones in your garden. Now, this is included in my new book, The Permaculture Garden, where I go into detail on how to use them. But in a nutshell, there are 5 core zones in permaculture. Zone 1 is the most intensive part of your garden, where you need to visit at least once, if not maybe 2 or 3 times a day, for example, checking up on your seedlings. Zone 5 is the wild area, where you might only visit it, 2 or 3 times a year to do a little bit of foraging, for example, the hedge at the back. You can split up your garden using this zoning thing from most intensive to least intensive to improve the efficiency, and this can be applied to any scale of garden. This is the best productivity tip that I can give you, is understanding the multiple harvests that every single plant can provide. Now, of course, some might give you some flowers and then you've got the plant material to put on the compost, which is 2 harvests. But in the permaculture garden, I use the example of a broad bean plant, which gives you 8 core harvests that you can enjoy. Now, taking that a step further, so many more things than we realize in the garden can provide us with more than one edible harvest. For example, the broad beans provide us something like 4 different types of edible harvest, but that's just scratching the surface. Within your kitchen garden, so much is edible. Runner bean flowers, squash leaves, beetroot leaves, kale flower shoots. These are all additional harvests that we can use. Cauliflower leaves, another one that we can use, and if we see that as edible food and we're growing it anyway, then that is how, literally within a few minutes of understanding all of these other additional harvests, your garden has maybe increased in productivity by about 30 or 40%. And it works for perennials too, like the leaves of a goji berry are edible. Next up is a lot of common things that you don't really need to worry about. For example, companion planting, crop rotation, or even doing a planting plan. If you follow a polyculture where you grow lots of different things in the same space, you have so much flexibility to adapt to changing needs, or if there's a potential crop failure, you can react to that nice and easily. If you've got a crop rotation or you're doing companion planting, it's actually holding you back. So the core tip here, I would say, is focus on something called succession planting by creating a monthly sowing list. Instead of worrying about a planting plan, make a list of what you need to sow each month to make sure that as soon as something is harvested, you have another plant to replace that and boost the productivity of your garden. Next up is one of my favourites, and that is to make sure that you spread aromatic herbs and flowers for beneficial insects and pollinators throughout your garden. Don't just put it to your perimeters, put it in your beds, utilising that idea of polyculture and growing things like dill and coriander and also things like calendula and borage, which attract these beneficial insects, which in a permaculture garden, they're there to act as your protectors, to protect you from pests and to keep your garden nice and healthy. You can then take this a step forward by growing perennial flowers and herbs which come back year after year and give you the same benefits. Two of my absolute favourites have to be chives and Korean mint. Take inspiration from nature and use layers. Like in a woodland, plants grow in different layers. We can use that principle in our gardens, but it goes beyond that, because by creating all of these different layers, you're creating different microclimates. You're creating more sunny borders, you're creating shadier areas, and this works in so many different ways. For example, whenever I plant a trellis of runner beans, very often at the base, I will plant out some herbs because they will utilize that shade. Or behind the A-frame of peas, I will transplant lettuce so they won't bolt over summer, so again increasing their productivity. And then on the other side, I can grow sun-loving crops, for example squash. And the side effect of creating a garden with lots of layers is that it looks truly stunning. Focus on building as much fertility within your garden, and there are so many ways of doing this. Of course, creating compost is a wonderful way. If you have a small garden, you might want to do something like pathway compost, or in my book I show other things like pocket composting and trench composting. And then you can focus on other ways of naturally building fertility. Comfrey is a wonder plant for that. That's a great thing to plant at the base of your compost bins to soak up the nutrients. And you can use that to create a powerful liquid feed for your tomatoes and other hungry crops. The easiest liquid feed to make is just a bog standard weed soak. And these liquid feeds can be supplemental nutrition, especially towards the end of the season, just to help increase the productivity and health of your plants. And of course, I can't talk about building natural fertility without mentioning mulching with natural materials, for example wood chip and grass. As these break down, they feed the soil, they add carbon and other nutrients into the soil over the long term and make a wild difference in terms of the health of your soil and thus the health of your plants. Now, you might have heard of this proverb, which is the best fertilizer is the gardener's shadow. So what you want to do is think about other ways that you can enjoy the space within your garden. Like if you like reading, create a little reading corner. If you love cooking, which is what I like to do, I like to make sure that I have a space to have a campfire or a barbecue so I can cook on that and enjoy my homegrown produce. Of course, I'm going to be able to spot things if I'm here more in the garden and do a little bit of extra gardening, but the main focus is actually a different type of productivity beyond that of yield. It's a productivity that kind of nourishes our mind by spending more time outdoors closer to nature. If you like those tips, then you will love the permaculture garden. Nearly 300 pages jam-packed with my top tips that you can apply and adapt to your own gardens. And so whilst you wait for your copy to arrive, I think you'll enjoy these two videos.